Mr. Charlie Lindbergh, he flew to old Berlin, got him a big iron cross, and he flew right back again to Washington, Washington.
Hello. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about Philip Roth's novel, The Plot Against America. This is a political novel and a Bildungsroman, or a coming-of-age story. And while it was written in 2004, or published in 2004 at least, from the perspective of 2020 in Trump's America, it's an incredibly prescient novel. So mostly I'm going to be talking about the political aspects of the novel, because I think, for me, that's more interesting. Basically, this is set in the early 1940s, and it's narrated by a fictionalized version of Philip Roth as a young child, 7 to 9 years old. And that's actually it's an important choice, because while this is clearly written in the past tense, and it's clear that this is written as a kind of memoir style, because we have references to things that happen as late as 1960, it's significant that this is presented more or less from the perspective of a child, slightly prepubescent, pre-adolescent, because on the one hand, there's naivete and confusion, both about the sort of personal struggles of his family members and the things that are happening, but also political naivete, a generalized willingness to accept his father's interpretation of national political events, but also he's getting other interpretations from his brother, who briefly gets involved with the Lindbergh administration, and from Rabbi Bengelsdorf, who marries his aunt, who's a big part of the Lindbergh administration. I'll talk more about what I mean by the Lindbergh administration in just a little bit. So there's that confusion and that sort of naivete and trustingness about accepting the political word of adults, and the difficulty that young fictional Philip Roth has in reconciling these different interpretations. But there's also there's a point where he talks about a child's cunning. So he's also at that sort of age where, especially things like emotions, he's able to read and he's able to figure out what it is that adults want from him as a child. How should he be reacting to this situation based on the cues from the adults? So he's at that sort of stage where he's still very much a sort of integrated part of the family, drawing from others, but he's also becoming an independent human being. So that, and those sort of struggles in a politically tense time are a big portion of the novel. But again, I'm going to focus more on the political side of the novel, because this is a historical fiction novel in which the 1940 Republican presidential convention is deadlocked until Charles A. Lindbergh, the nation's hero and one of the sort of major aviators of the early age of flight, arrives at the convention by plane that he's flown in his aviator stuff, with his white flowy scarf and his leather hat and whatever all it is. And Lindbergh basically takes the convention by storm, wins the Republican National Convention, and then after an incredibly unconventional presidential campaign, where he basically flies from city to city across the country and basically repeats the promise that he will keep America out of the Second World War, whereas a vote for FDR would mean a vote for war. That's basically his entire presidential spiel, and he gets elected in a landslide. The Republican Party gets control of both houses of Congress, and from the perspective of the Roths, who are a Jewish family, this is incredibly dangerous because Lindbergh, and so this is where we have us. So obviously Lindbergh did not really get elected president in 1940, but in the 1930s, he had repeatedly gone to Nazi Germany. He had spoken with admiration about the Nazi Party and about the way that Germany was rebuilding its air force, reorganizing its society, etc., etc. He had made anti-Semitic statements. He had accepted a medal from the Nazis, which he then later declined to return. And so there was a lot of concern, and people are still divided about this, about whether or not Lindbergh himself was a Nazi or a direct Nazi supporter, or whether or not he was just an isolationist, because he very clearly was. He was very much opposed to the U.S. entering World War II, to the point where he even resigned his colonelcy in the Army Air Corps, I think it was, rather than serve under FDR, because he believed FDR was going to bring us into the war. And so there are some people who argue he was an out-and-out Nazi. There are others who argue that he was just an isolationist, and actually when he went to Nazi Germany, he was reporting back what he was seeing about their aeronautical innovations and things like that. But and so some people, and he served in World War II in a sort of civilian consultant capacity, but he never served in Europe. He only served in the Pacific. So that's worth noting. But Lindbergh was associated with an organization called America First. And for those of you who've paid attention during the Trump years, that will ring a bell. And America First was ostensibly, again, an isolationist organization whose goal was to keep America out of the war. But they had a large number of overtly pro-Nazi speakers. And there's much more evidence, I think, that America First was a Nazi front group, along with organizations like the German American Bund. And this is one of the key things about Lindbergh's administration in Roth's novel, is that things are rarely overt. There's almost always a reasonable explanation that can hide a potentially malicious intent. And part of the artistry of Roth's novel is that he never says absolutely one way or the other. So, for instance, there are a couple of different programs that the Lindbergh administration implements. There's the Just Folks program, and of course, folk or Volk was a key ideological term in Nazi Germany, and so we shouldn't miss that. But the Just Folks program is intended basically to take the children of ethnic minorities and send them to the American heartland to work on farms with white Christian proper Americans for a couple of weeks or whatever it is. What we do find out is that the primary ethnic minority who the Just Folks program served was Jews. So Philip's brother Sandy is involved in this program. He gets sent to Kentucky to work on a tobacco farm, and then he becomes a sort of local speaker promoting the Just Folks program. Philip's father, Herman, takes the position, and I think this is generally the position that Philip takes in the novel as well, is that this was a program designed to drive a wedge between Jewish parents who want their children to remain distinctly Jewish, and Jewish children were then going and seeing how Christians live. And in the case of Sandy, like, he eats a lot of pork. He eats bacon, he eats ham, he eats pork sausages, and the Roths are a kosher family. So that element of transgression supports the idea that this is about breaking down the bonds of the Jewish family. We similarly have the Homestead 42 Act, which is intended to take Jewish families from the large urban centers like New York and Newark, New Jersey, where the Roths live, and sort of disperse them throughout the country. And so Herman is working for Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, and that company signs on with the Homestead 42 program, and they try to send the Roths to Kentucky. Again, Kentucky being the apparent place where you send Jews from New Jersey. And so the only reason they get out of that is because Herman actually quits his job and goes to work for his brother, who he hates, doing a terrible job for less money. So, I mean, this is the sort of the situation is there are these programs that the official explanation of them is that they're meant to incorporate, or they're meant to sort of further engage American Jews into the life of the Christian community. And we actually get this. So Rabbi Bengelsdorf, who's a big deal intellectual rabbi in Newark, becomes the head of the OAA, or the Office of American Absorption, which runs these programs. And he makes the case very directly that this is simply about further ingraining Jews into the fabric of America. So one point at dinner, at the one dinner he comes to at the Roth's house, he explains, "The Jews of America, the rabbi told us at dinner, are unlike any other community of Jews in the history of the world. They have the greatest opportunity accorded to our people in modern times. The Jews of America can participate fully in the national life of their country. They need no longer dwell apart, a pariah community separated from the rest. All that is required is the courage that your son Sandy displayed by going on his own into the unknown of Kentucky to work for the summer as a farmhand there. I believe that Sandy and the other Jewish boys like him in the Just Folks program should serve as models not only for every Jewish child growing up in this country, but for every Jewish adult. And this is not merely a dream of mine, it is the dream of President Lindbergh." So again, this is one of the brilliant things about the novel, is there's this tenuous balance between the official explanation, which tells us that this is about incorporating American Jews into the fabric of the nation, and thereby making them more fully citizens, more fully part of America as such. But it also breaks down the fabric of Jewish identity. I mean, it isolates individual Jews or Jewish families in Christian communities. It puts, in the case of Sandy, Jewish children onto farms where they consume pork, which again is a violation of kosher dietary laws, and so on and so on. And so the stakes here are really high. And what ultimately is sort of the tipping point in the novel is that Walter Winchell, who was Jewish, it was a major figure in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. He runs against Lindbergh as basically the only person in the national media who's still critiquing Lindbergh. So he runs against Lindbergh for president, and he gets assassinated. At which point, there are a series of anti-Semitic riots and pogroms across, especially the American South. Kentucky, Alabama, Missouri, places like this. and Winchell is actually killed in Louisville, Kentucky, or Louisville, Kentucky, as people not from Kentucky pronounce it. And so what happens is that Lindbergh flies to Louisville, and that seems to be his solution to any sort of public relations problem is, oh, I'll just fly somewhere, give a brief speech, and then fly back. And that it consistently seems to work. So Lindbergh flies to Louisville and basically just says, hey everybody, let's not riot, sort of. But it's not a compelling speech. He's just basically like, hey, I'm here, things are prosperous, going back to DC now. But he never makes it back to DC. And so that the disappearance of Lindbergh, which is another thing that Roth never gives us a definite answer on, kicks off another wave of anti-Semitic violence, and it opens the door for Lindbergh's vice president to declare martial law and to bring in soldiers to control the country and things like this, which sort of very overtly says to everybody, all right, this was always basically a secret Nazi plot. So Lindbergh's fate is an open question in the novel, but we have a number of potential suggestions. The most basic and innocuous is just that he crashed somewhere between Kentucky and DC, and the plane and the body were never found. There's also a theory that the Germans, that the Nazis put forward, that he was captured by a massive Jewish-British conspiracy, that British fighter planes took him to Canada on the orders of a whole cabal of American Jews, including people like Roosevelt and Mayor LaGuardia of New York, who's half Jewish, half Italian, and who becomes the sort of successor political candidate after Winchell's assassination, and all these things. And so all of these people get arrested, and Rabbi Bengelsdorf gets arrested because it's suspected that he's sort of brainwashing or whatever it is Mrs. Lindbergh. But then it comes out that, in fact, and so the other theory from the British and confirmed by, of all people, Yugoslav partisans fighting the Nazis, is that Lindbergh actually flies out over the ocean, crashes his plane at a designated spot. The Nazis pick him up and take him to Berlin. So the ending of the novel, the political ending of the novel, is actually really quite bizarre, and in some ways one of the least satisfying parts of the novel, because basically Mrs. Lindbergh is taken to Walter Reed Hospital, from which she then escapes after about 24 hours to announce from basically on a secret radio broadcast, well, a public radio broadcast from a secret location, that in fact she had been held by the government and by the agents of the now acting president, so basically she actually gives a really quite brilliant speech. She says, "My fellow Americans, unlawfulness on the part of America's law enforcement agencies cannot and will not be allowed to prevail. In my husband's name, I ask all National Guard units to disarm and disband, and for our guardsmen to return to civilian life. I ask all members of the United States Armed Forces to leave our cities and to regroup at their home bases under the command of their authorized senior officers. I ask the FBI to release all of those arrested on charges of conspiring to harm my husband and to restore immediately their full rights as citizens. I ask law enforcement authorities throughout the nation to do the same with those who have been detained in local and state jails. There is not a shred of evidence that a single detainee is in any way responsible for whatever befell my husband and his plane on or after Wednesday, October 7th, 1942. I ask the New York City Police to vacate the illegally occupied premises of government-sequestered newspapers, magazines, and radio stations, and that these facilities resume their normal activities as guaranteed under the First Amendment of the Constitution. I ask the Congress of the United States to initiate proceedings to remove from office the current acting President of the United States and to appoint a new President in accordance with the Presidential Succession Act of 1886, which designates the Secretary of State as next in line for the presidency should the Vice Presidency be vacant. The Succession Act of 1886 also states that, under the circumstances described, Congress shall decide whether to call a special presidential election, and so I ask the Congress to do just that and to authorize a presidential election that will coincide with the congressional election scheduled for the first Tuesday after first Monday of November. So she gives this speech, and basically everything that she asks for is done. Like martial law, military rule, the arrest of all of these people. The people are just like, meh, well, that's fine. Guess we don't need that anymore. So martial law is ended. The acting president is arrested. Everybody who is arrested under suspicion of conspiracy to kidnap Charles Lindbergh is released, and so on and so on. There's a new election. FDR wins by a landslide. The Democrats retake Congress. And basically then the rest of World War II just sort of happens the way that it happened in reality, just 2 years later. So, I mean, it's a sort of fantasy type ending where it's just sort of like, well, one person can change the entire direction of the country with a speech, and then everybody's just gonna accept that.